whole question of the urban and rural thing is, I have a slightly different take on it. Maybe some of you may agree with me or may not agree with me. I think to me it's a false dichotomy. It doesn't exist actually. And I seriously contest the view that the urban is a byproduct of the rural. I think they came together in a way. It's a continuum of progression of human growth. It's very important to understand that like in most of the parts of the country, people settled first where along the rivers and along wetlands and also migrated along river valleys. So when these movements of human groups took place very early on, people tended to stay near the water, where water was easily available, which is why the greatest civilizations of the world were like the Nile Valley civilization, for example, or the Ganga Valley or the Indus Valley civilization. They are along the rivers. So in many of these kind of beginnings, actually the rural came after the urban, in a sense, in a manner of speaking. They spread from these collectives into other areas and started settling settling forest lands and hills which are on the river valleys, and started cultivating there or settle down in these small communities and form small communities or villages or hamlets. So in certain processes, I see it as not necessarily the rural came first, but sometimes it was the urbanization concept that came first. People living together came first and then spread into areas where it was more difficult to settle, and settle agriculture, for example, came much later than Sweden forms of agriculture. Very often words that we use carry with them a lot of baggage of concepts and ideas and biases and prejudices and preconceived notions, things that are written already and things we read from our literature, from the books that we read or we learn from our peers or from our teachers in school. So these things can tend to get stuck in our heads at a very cognitive level or at the subconscious level as well, both at the conscious and subconscious level, and these act out in various forms. And when I say urban, you immediately conceive something else. The picture that comes before your eyes is something quite in a way it's quite established, in this kind of a cliched picture comes of skyscrapers, streets, cities, cars, crowded crowds, these kind of things, big markets, these kind of things come up, and urban areas, in a way, the concept of urban in a very generic concept of agglomeration or people concentrating in a particular way, living together for various kinds of purposes, is sometimes viewed very differently in different parts. In Imphal, for example, where I come from, it's called a city, but it's not a city. It's a collection of villages actually. It's villages that grew out and grew and came together. For example, it's happening in Hyderabad also. Villages come together. Imphal is actually a collection in that way of villages, and every part of Imphal is actually a distinct village, and you can actually feel the difference as you go through Imphal. And the market areas are very small. They are along the rivers of Imphal, and they are very small places, and they're not huge. But this is also changing, you see, as it becomes more cityized. Then every street has become a marketplace. Everybody wants to open a shop. And there was a time when one of our elders, very long ago, said that every gate will be a shop, and that's happening today. And these are some of the changes that I see in terms of ideas, in terms of words that we use. So some of the dominant features I just wanted to recap is that in terms of human activity, as we see also now in India very well in terms of human economic activity, human enterprise, there's a very, very still a rapid rate of growth, despite everything that we talk about, growth rate and this and that, leave all those kind of things aside, we see today that many of people are very busy today, Everybody is very busy. Whether it's a shopkeeper or the woman in the family or the children going to school, the young people going to university, people in the services. So there is definitely this fast pace of business in the sense of busyness, People very busy everywhere, is going on, and this rate seems to be increasing. This rate of people getting busier and busier, and whatever people say about the global financial crisis of the 2008, 2009, or the GDP going up or going down, whatever this thing is, what is visible is that there is an increasing rate of business by everybody, and this is something that is happening that at a global scale, and not only at the local level, at a global scale, and this is really something in a sense very frightening in a sense, and where it's going to all lead to. And even now today, if you see in the papers, people are talking, World Bank is saying that India is going to be again growing at 7+ and 8+ by next year, and the rates of recoveries of countries, downward trends are also being, touted about as the resilience of our economic, activity, economic, the rightness of our policies, etc. And I don't know whether any of you have come across the use of the certain kind of a concept called the Great Acceleration. This is something that I wanted to talk about, because this is very, to me at least, it's very important for all of us to realize the kind of changes that we see in our lives has increased particularly in the last 30 years. The amount of changes that have occurred is much more than what has happened in the last 500 years, for example, And this is the frightening part of it, this rapid increase of the trajectory of human progress, human business, and human financial world, human economic activity is sort of hitting the roof in many aspects. And as we talk about the period of glaciers, in terms of the eras of human civilization of the earth, okay, in terms of different eras, we are talking now of what is known as the Anthropocene period, where human activity is creating the biggest changes, and not the traditional climatic and other geological or tectonic kind of changes that have been influencing the earth. Is human activity itself which is now the biggest influence on earth, and this is being now recognized more and more as a new era of the earth, as the Anthropocene period. And this is related to the concept of the Great Acceleration. Now, we have population trends that are, as we know, if you look at the UN figures and UN projections, we're going to be, by the end of this century, we're going to be hitting something like 11 billion people on earth, and even though in many areas of the world, the childbearing rate, in terms of fertility rates, are still quite high. People are saying that the child, what is known as the peak child, has been passed now, and in many areas they have hit 2.5 per, instead of 2.5 children per woman, and it's getting lower. Even in India, many states are now below 2.5, like Kerala, for example, or many other states in the south are now in fact below 2, okay, hitting just now replacement levels, while some of the like Bihar is the highest now, but it's standing out as alone as one of the highest. In other states, these kind of child fertility rates are decreasing, and this is a trend that is happening all over the world. Crossing of the peak child that is happening, and now what is happening is that we're going to have huge numbers of still bludgeoning populations. In spite of this, by 2100 is coming like 12 billion people, 11 billion people. It's not a joke, it's like I know how it's going to work out. At the same time, consumption is increasing. We see this trend of consumption. I'm not talking about urban consumption or rural consumption. I'm just talking about human consumption, man. Everybody is consuming. Everybody is shitting everywhere, and everybody is eating. Everybody is consuming, and fertilizers consumption, paper production, paper use, water. Big crisis. Water use, water consumption. These are all rising. At the same time, there is a trend where, because of the limited resources in terms of limited availability of rivers, for example, the number of large dams that are going to be built also is becoming limited. You can't have endless number of dams, There's only, because there are not endless number of rivers and river valleys. So this kind of large dam constructions are also beginning to level out, while the trend is still continuing of building new dams. It's beginning to level out. It's not like before. And this is over the last, I'm talking about a trend over the last 10, 15 years. India is still one of the biggest dam makers of the world. And in fact, India is now not really unique, but one of the big players in doing this cascade, what is known as cascade projects, where they make multiple dams on one river, one after the other, like the Tista, for example, in Sikkim, going through Bangladesh. We have Tista 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, upper Tista, lower Tista. It used to be one of the most wild rivers of the northeast region of North Bengal, and known for its high speed of flow, known for flooding the banks during the monsoons and almost uncontrollable flow. Today, Tista has become a series of ponds. It doesn't flow anymore. It's a much talked about river in the sense that, and so this kind of dam constructions are becoming limited now, and though water use is becoming increased, water resources are also becoming more or less freezing up. So this is a very big problem that we see. Transport is an issue which is no longer just refined or defined by cities. It's everywhere now. Transportation. The number of motor vehicles in the villages and in the rural areas also is not funny anymore. There's a lot of now motor vehicles. Tourism is entering now into rural areas, into targeting these places, so that transportation activity is also increasingly getting out of urban areas into rural areas. And this is also causing a kind of blur. There's no division anymore between rural and urban, in the sense that this constant blurring is happening. And you can see this in the transportation as number of vehicles, kind of traffic that's going on between these areas. And this is also happening because along with it is the telecommunications, the boom in the telecommunications sector of our lives, with the boom of this one that happened around in the early 90s. With this came a huge boom in telecommunications, which is cutting across rural-urban so-called divides. And we have this again, another new kind of business that comes along with the telecommunications boom, and a lot of things gets transported. It becomes a carrier for a lot of different things. And I'm not going to go into these details, but one very interesting milestone I want to talk about, which some of you may be aware, is that 2008 was a historic milestone for this earth. You know why? 2008 was when over 50% of the global population live in urban, it crossed 50% urban areas population in 2008. And now most of the population is now in urban areas. In fact, the world is becoming almost going, its trajectory is towards total urbanity, total urbanization, and gradual disappearance of the rural, so-called rural concept we're talking about, and this is part of the great acceleration process, and part of the new era of the Anthropocene era that we're going to discuss this. And these kind of trends that we see in the Earth system, if you look at Earth as a system, there are also many variations as I've described. Some things are happening, it's increasing, some things are decreasing, some of the trajectories are decreasing, some things are shrinking while some things are expanding. So there is how these interact with each other and how these will balance out is becoming more and more difficult to predict today in terms of our future. And it's becoming very, very difficult to project how long it will take before any kind of balances are going to be, reached, and how we can play a role in this as individuals or in groups or in organizations can play a role in this balancing out process. I haven't talked about climate change, but we're talking about particularly the three basic long-lived greenhouse gases I'm talking about, which is carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. Both are not growing at the same pace. For example, methane is growing at a much slower pace than carbon dioxide. And they are not bursting together at the same pace. So we have also differing influences on the climate change pattern because of these differential rates of growth of increase, rates of increase of these three long-lived gases that we are talking about. So these will also have different impacts on how climate change plays out, because as far as we know, despite whatever Trump says and Trump thinks, there is now almost incontrovertible evidence that it's because of us that this is happening. There's a link between what we are doing and we have been doing for decades and what is happening in terms of our climate and the change that is happening with the burning. But at the same time, these things are increasing, certain things are decreasing also, and there's a kind of a stabilization process that we are thinking at a scientific level that even these kind of changes in climate and global temperature rise can also be stabilized with our own efforts, can help to stabilize this. And this is the vision with which the movement for certain changes in the way we conduct our lives, to conduct our business, conduct the way we move, the way we live, the way we eat, the way we grow things, the way we consume can have an impact on these kind of changes that we are seeing today. And this is something that I just wanted to flag along with the other concept that I introduced, which is on the continuum of the urban rural. One of the big problems that I have is the term natural resources, and everything becomes a resource, human resource, natural resource, resource person, this but in reality, when we talk about the issues that we are focusing on, we are perforce have to talk about natural resources and how we deal with natural resources. If we can't engage with this debate, then there's no use talking about urbanization and the planet. If we can't engage with the debate of natural resources, what are these natural resources? What are the problems associated with them? And what does it mean what could it mean, what has it meant, what it means for us today, and what it could mean for us tomorrow. These are things that we need to ask and grapple with, and we have to talk about this here in this room, while we have this in the bottles, which is not supposed to be, and this costs more to produce and has more problems than just digging out of the tap, We have to talk about natural resources, and that's one thing is we have to have an understanding in terms of a conceptual idea frame. ये जो natural resource क्या है? What is this natural resource? We are talking about, and why there is in certain communities these ideas differ from certain other communities, particularly among the tribal peoples, for example. In India, the Adivasis, the tribes, the indigenous peoples, they have quite a different perception and conception of what is natural resources than what is held by other people. So we talk about nature as if, we are not part of it. Just as we talk about urban as though rural is not part of it, or we talk about rural as though urban is not part of it. There's always this separation, going on. And people talk about dichotomies and so many things, gaps, divisions, walls. But in traditions like mine, for example, who are indigenous peoples or tribal peoples, the separation between natural and human becomes not so distinct, and we are considered, because our belief system is quite different from the today's modern religions. Our belief system is more closer to what is called as animistic traditions. Because of that, we are part of the ecological community. We become part of it, and you can see that in terms of our relationships, many of the indigenous peoples are related to one or the other natural entity. It can be a living entity or even a non-living entity. For example, the Lepchas of Sikkim. In Sikkim, there is a small group of tribal peoples, Lepchas, and their relatives are mountains, And it's not all mountains. One particular mountain is my relative, by this clan. This clan has this mountain as a relative, and this clan has that mountain as a relative. And these are very distinct identifications. It's not vaguely that all rivers are my relatives. In Manipur, particularly in the valley, which is full of wetlands and lakes, different communities have got different relationship with different wetlands. Okay, and those, for example, in the Moirang area have a particular relationship with Loktak Lake, okay, which is the famous lake of Manipur, which is a Ramsar site. Loktak Lake is the mother, is an ancestor. In certain other areas is Pumlen or Waithau. Okay, different wetlands, because these are the kind of traditions that are in some sense, I would say pre-Western, or pre-modern traditions that are there. And this is something that I want to flag, is because the way we have distanced ourselves from these kind of conceptions is also having a very, very big weightage in the way we relate and the way we live with such kind of nature. And one of the persons that I interact with quite closely is one of the independent UN experts on indigenous people's rights, Vicky Taulikorpus. She is herself a tribe indigenous person, and she's a nurse, by the way, by profession, background, she's a nurse, like I'm a medical doctor, and we came into human rights work together very early on. We met many years ago, and she was sharing something recently called eco-colonization. Have you ever heard the term eco-colonization? Eco-colonization is a term where indigenous peoples and their leaders are now being portrayed as fighting with activists who are working for environmental causes, and indigenous peoples are coming and clashing. Because very interesting, because one normally thinks that environmental activism, working with, as you said, we are working for the rights of tribal peoples. We are working for them, we are advocates, we join them, we live with them, we work for their, we try to understand their concepts and the ways of life, their ideas, their belief systems, how they, how they understand the world, and that's how we work with them. But now there is a trend where activism is enforcing certain views on indigenous peoples and the way they want to grow in a self-determined manner, in terms of how they want to grow in the way they see best for themselves. So that is not being allowed by activism, because activism comes with certain strict codes and principles and ethics and concepts. So if there is a differing, where there is a difference comes, then a clash comes, and indigenous peoples are calling it eco-colonization, where like ecotourism, eco-colonization, where certain kinds of concepts are colonizing now, not like the imperial period of colonization from the Western kingdoms, etc., European kingdoms. We're talking about activists colonizing ecological concepts and ecological ideas among tribal peoples and causing a divide. Now, I find this interesting because it could be, what is behind this is more interesting to me to explore. Why are people talking about this? What is it trying to, what's the message it's going to carry? Who is responsible for this kind of messaging? And what benefits would they accrue from this kind of messaging? I mean, these are the questions that I want to throw open. Why are we talking about this thing? Why is it becoming an international issue today? I mean, why? Is it because they want to create a certain polemic, a certain kind of a hostile environment is created in literature, in the media, a certain hostility is being proposed where there are none, or where it is the conflict is not in terms of a war, but in terms of a debate or a discussion of settling of differences, trying to adjust to each other, but seeing more as a clash, to portray it as an all-right clash, and to say it's colonization of a particular kind is to tar everything that activists and environmentalists do with a black tar of colonization and discredit their work. And who benefits from the discrediting of activism at the ecological and environmental level? At the same time, discrediting indigenous peoples for saying that, oh, we want to have better deal for ourselves from Vedanta, We are not saying that Vedanta should not come entirely. They can come, but they come on our terms. We make the deal with them, not the government of Odisha. We make our deal with them. And the benefit should come to us directly because it's our land and our relatives, our earth, our territory. And when this kind of argument comes in, which is a more self-determined argument, environmental activists is being portrayed as being anti-environment, anti-ecological movement, and being again tarred by a certain black brush again as being they are selling out. वो sell out कर रहा है ना? They are being bought by Vedanta, by the business corporate community. Many years ago in Canada, in Quebec, there's a huge tribe called the Cree people. It's a native tribe of Canada. The Cree people have a huge area, okay, in the Hudson Bay area, which is bordering Canada and the US on the eastern side. And they made a deal with Hydro-Quebec. Hydro-Quebec was the big power corporation making dams, a private company, one of the biggest in the world, Hydro-Quebec. They made a deal, and they got a deal with Hydro-Quebec. They said, you can come and build a dam, but you deal with us and not with any other entity. And other indigenous peoples, the international movement said, the Cree have bloody sold out. They have betrayed the cause of the indigenous peoples who've been fighting against dams for so long and against hydropower. And why are the Cree doing this? So the Cree was painted in a particular way, and the Cree was being seen as a colonized people through this decision, that they have been colonized in a particular way, in the way they live, and they are now being bought by money, and they are being brought into a particular system, and thereby the whole character of the Cree nation will change because of hydropower, what is happening. And these are the fears that have been going on from the early 90s when Hydro-Quebec built the dam in Canada, and now it's become a global issue where eco-colonization is becoming a term, a concept that is being talked about and discussed openly. Now, this is a very interesting trend in terms of our conception of natural resources and how indigenous peoples or tribal peoples relate to their own land and territory in their forests and the rivers and their wetlands, And in terms of the changing, the background of what I talked about in terms of the many different changes that are happening in the great acceleration period of the Anthropocene era that we are here today in, where even the tribal people who are in a way very romantically linked with living in the forest and remote areas, wearing feathers in their hair, and painting themselves in a particular way and dancing and singing and living happily by themselves is changing. They also have this, Yeah, and with this comes a whole lot of new ideas and new links and new communications, new relationships, new contacts, and this is changing as well. And we have to bring this into focus when we talk about this concept that I'm talking about here. And another thing is types, typology in terms of resources. We have in the European or Western tradition, the things that we call our resources, oil, coal, mineral, what they call non-renewable, renewable, all these kind of concepts are being talked about. Sustainable development goals, before that there were the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, So all these concepts are there, but that we have, under this category, we also have the renewables like water and forests and fish and wildlife, and some people also add sunlight and wind and, flowing waters, etc., into all these concepts of resource, of types of resources. But these have, in this, as a group, how do we see ourselves to relate to this within the action of urbanization in the planet? How do we relate to these other life forms and non-life forms? Why are we not, if we say Save the Tiger, for example, is a big campaign, Tiger Project, or save this or save that, but when people want to change a certain landscape, people don't protest as much. Landscapes are changing. The beauty of our natural environment is also being shaped and reshaped and changed by our own decisions. Hills are disappearing. around our cities, new cities new hills are being formed by landfills, for example, from the garbage that we throw out, Suddenly they become new urban green areas. When we talk about landscape also, when have you ever heard of the Trans-Asian Railway? Just like the Trans-Asian Highway project, there is a Trans-Asian Railway project. And I happen to come from a part of India where both these projects are going through our homelands, through Manipur in particular. Trans-Asian Highway 2 is going through Imphal. Trans-Asian Railway is going through Imphal, is going to be a big link up. And because of this, there is constant digging going on, in Manipur. Holes, big holes are being dug. Holes are being dug in our valleys, in our hills. There are holes being dug through our hills so that trains can pass through them. And whole landscapes are changing. Whole existing landscapes are changing in the northeast because of the development projects and of the digging that's going on. But very few people are actually concerned with it. They're concerned about pollution. They're concerned that they are dumping sludge and gravel and mud into the rivers. Lower Subansiri mein kya ho raha hai, in the Subansiri river, because of the project, Lower Subansiri hydro, everything is getting dumped in the river. The river is completely polluted. Now there's nothing you can do there, and this is happening to many rivers. But nobody is worried that the landscape itself is changing. Certain things that you grew up with when you get out of the house in the morning and see before you as the sun rises or see as the sun sets, that's changing. And that change, we think, is not influencing us and how we live our lives. I think there is a very close link to that as well, with our memories, with our visual memories, which comes with our emotional memories, Our sensual memories are equally important, and how it shapes the way we live today. So when these are being shaped and reshaped and destroyed, and what we see, we get up in the morning and see is gone from there, how it affects us is something that we don't think about, we don't conceptualize, we don't debate, we don't write about it, we don't read about it very much. These are very real. And when I say resource, I'm talking about these resources as well, which are linked to not things as such and defined to things, but how things relate, the ecology of relationship, the relationship between human beings and what we are embedded in within our natural world. How we do this is something that we need to engage more and more with in order to understand, our planet again, to reconnect in terms with our planet. Forget about urbanization. We just need to reconnect with the planet first. If we don't reconnect with the planet, whether we are getting urbanized or whether this urbanization process at one time will reverse itself and become a ruralization process as well, because the ruralization process also occurs where people leave the cities and want to go away from there. They are fed up, I left Delhi many years ago. I worked in Delhi for over 10 years, in a very hi-fi hospital, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Indian Council of Medical Research, all those big towers, 10 years was enough. So there are people who are going away also. And this trend, who knows, may escalate, may change. It may not be a trickle, it may become a flow. And from flow, it can become a big gush, leaving the cities to do other things. Because the way our communications and telecommunication, transportation environment is changing, everything is now available everywhere, now becoming available everywhere. It doesn't matter whether you live in a city or not, you know. In fact, if you want organic food, it's better not to come here. You go and grow it yourself over there and buy and share it with your neighbors who also grow their own, you know. So that's one thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of our worldview. Oh, this is another interesting one. This is a tribesman from Manipur, you know. If you look at this picture, I'm using this because as human beings, when we are from very primitive cultures, primitive ways of life to what we call the modern man or the consumer man, consumer human being, we are the people who are always exploiting, we are the people who are hunting, we are the people who are cultivating, we are the people who are, you know, eating and cutting and killing. So we are the people who are we consider ourselves the dominant, you know, species. We take to ourselves the right to exploit nature, to tame nature. Sometimes they use the word taming, you know, tame the rivers and all that. And as a hunter, he's wearing on his head a hornbill bird's feather, you know. He hunts the hornbill for particular use. The use of the hornbill is not for eating as such, not so much, but for the trophy of its beautiful feathers. Because the hornbill is not a very common bird. It's a less common bird in our forests, but they're still there abundantly. There's a status involved with wearing a hornbill feather in his hair, you know, and he's a hunter. But at the same time, there's a concept that they are also human beings like him. There are 7 skulls over there, and they were also hunters, but they became the hunted, you know. Okay, so the hunter-hunted concept is also a changing concept. The hunter can become hunted, you know, and the hunted becomes the hunter. So this is the kind of shifting concepts that we sometimes don't understand and keep in touch with. That as we talk about ourselves, people talk about how we have distanced ourselves. In the cities, we consider ourselves as the owners, and we consider ourselves, we are separated from certain concepts. We are not so closely linked with certain ideas of natural resources, you know. We are not so dependent on so much directly to them as other cultures, other tribes. But it's very important to understand that it's not because we are not, it's because we have lost touch. We are still dependent, you know. It's just that we have lost the link between what we are doing and what we are consuming and what we live with today, or the fire that we use, the gas that we use in our homes to cook, where it comes from, which is underground, which is a non-renewable fuel, you know, which we are burning up. We are lost in touch. We think that it's like how in Laos, as you know, in Vietnam, there was a long war, the Vietnam War, and it spread into Cambodia and Laos as well. And there were many years in which the agriculturists, the farmers of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos could not farm their land anymore because of the war. And for many years, they left the fields, and even if they had opportunity to farm, they didn't have time to harvest what they farmed also. So there was a huge food crisis. You know, apart from the human suffering and deaths that happened, there was also the huge food crisis in this region of Indochina, Laos, Cambodia at that time. And one of the important things that happened there is that much of the food was airdropped. Rice and other commodities were dropped by Americans and their allies and other groups as well. They were airdropped, and many of the villages were fed through the airdropping of grains and other supplies for a long time. So when the war ended, and suddenly schools started functioning and things became slowly, some of the education institutes started working, the children started coming back to school, and one of the questions that the schools faced were asking the small middle level school children was, where does rice come from, and they all said like this. They grew up in an era where they never saw rice growing in the fields and being harvested. They only knew that rice came from the sky, So it's that loss of linkage with our environment and where the sources of our livelihood that causes this alienation, the alienated way we live in our urban areas, in our urban communities, and we forget that who feeds us, where the water comes from. This is the Tista, It's a interesting. There's a girl from Darjeeling. She's a Lepcha, and she's had a very, very interesting documentary film called Voices of Tista, and she used illustration, Lepcha artists to illustrate how the Lepcha people relate to the river, because the river, they have a spiritual relationship with the river, with the mountains, which is not an economic relationship, and they are being nurtured spiritually by the river, not economically. There's a spiritual nurturing process that's going on, this enriching process, and this is how the dams have caused a big break in this relationship between the Lepcha and the Tista. And so, what is the river? Many people, when you say, what is the river? If you ask somebody to define a river, many people can't define it. And when you say it's part of our life, or it's life, or it's a slightly very different concept from saying it's just water flowing from the mountain to the sea, going through different places, which is a physical description. But there is another description that's given to it, not as a resource, but also in terms of life, in terms of livelihood, in terms of emotion, in terms of relationship, not only with the water, but also the living beings like the plants, the lotus or the fish, or the sand, the rocks. So these are different aspects of the relationship that when we call life. When you say life, it's simple. It's only a 4-letter word, but it's such a deep word to use when you say life. And also Nadiya ka beauty, itna khubsurat, the beauty of a river. My God, the beauty of the Brahmaputra, the beauty of the of the Barak River, or the Ganga or Jamuna, or rivers of the south. In Vellore, where I studied my MBBS from, it was called a land or river without water, In the south, many of the rivers have dried up because they were the first dams. Many of the first dams were built and shed out in the river, in the southern rivers. And we had, I think the name of the river in Tamil Nadu, in Vellore district, was Pamba River. Pamba, no? Yeah, Pamba is there, no? Is it still flowing? Yeah. Okay, I'm surprised. Many rivers have stopped flowing, Yes, and now, and the question of the beauty of a river is not just the beauty of its physical beauty, but there is a mood to it, you see. The river has moods. In the winter, in the rain, in the mist, in the morning, in the evening, at the sunrise, at particular times of the year and the months, the rivers have different moods. Rivers are through which colonizations also occurred. Colonial expansion also occurred through rivers. It was through the control of rivers and river ports that the Portuguese and the French and the British, and trade in Kolkata, the Hooghly River, the control of the Hooghly. These are also the the areas where through which you could control trade and communities and power, spreading through. So rivers are very, very complex entities. I referred this to a journal called the Anthropocene Review. There's an international journal, and it's been around for some time. And the paper, the core paper that I used to base this presentation on is the concept of a great acceleration. That the great acceleration, the question is whether we are now heading for the great collapse. At the end of the great acceleration, when will the collapse happen? Because the more and more we accelerate, it's not going to be an infinite, it's not a sustainable progression of activity, and the collapse is imminent, is a very big question. From the mid-20th century, around the 1950s, 60s, this change happened from, in terms of geological epochs and eras of the earth, the older Holocene period, which was dominated by glacial activity, volcanic activities, and tectonic shifts, and these kind of things that dominated the Earth's general situation or changes, is now being taken over in the last 50-60 years by the Anthropocene period that began in the mid-20th. There's the shift in how the Earth system is functioning now, and we are playing a very big role in this. What we are doing is playing a very big role in this shift, where the shifts are happening in many fronts. The shifts are happening in not only in the economic front, but also in terms of birth rates, in terms of water availability, climate changes, a number of things. The indicators are there, which I won't go into, and that what is happening is that the imprint that we're leaving, our footprint, is becoming larger and larger on the Earth system, and in a sense that is beginning to have an impact that's much more than what the Earth's natural system can cope with in its natural processes, and is not able to catch up with. And so there has been huge changes because of this, and now we have changes in terms of wealth also, in terms of how the consumption pattern, as we say that everybody is consuming, but everybody is consuming not at the same pace or the same rate or the same amount. Some are consuming much more and much faster than others, And if you're going to say development means everybody consuming at the same pace, is going to be disaster, no? It's going to be like blueprint of disaster. If you start, everybody is consuming at the pace of the American middle class way of life, for example, when I did my postgraduate in Holland, and there was a classmate of mine from he's from Uganda, and one of the first things that we were exposed to when we came to the course, my postgraduate course, was to go and visit hospitals in the Netherlands, different hospitals, and see how hospitals work and different ways of managing hospitals. And we went and visited so many hospitals. And one day, as we were coming after a long visit to a hospital, it was in the evening, and we were walking, and he was asking me, he was telling me more like a remark, not so much as a question. He was asking me, when will my country become like this? He said, when will Uganda become like Holland? So I told him, when Uganda exploits the entire Africa like Holland did for so many centuries, then only Uganda will become like Holland. So you need to have certain forms of consumption are becoming so destructive, and as they say in 2010, the wealthy countries account for 74%. I think Oxfam came out with a new thing last year as well, no? Yes. It was some horrendous, statistics about consumption and how the global scale of inequality, is happening. And in that sense, what we are going through right now is it's a unique period. This has never happened before in the previous generations that we have lived in, that our past generations, our grandfathers and grandparents have never experienced what we have been experiencing in this generation that we are in right now. When I started going to school, there was no television, There was few people with telephones where you had to pick up and somebody asked you which number do you want to connect to, and you tell the number and that person would connect the two numbers and you could speak,
Trunk call.
Yeah, trunk call and also local calls. It used to be what is known as telephone exchange. There's something called exchange. Now there is no telephone exchange, Forget about mobile, that came much bit later on. I'm talking about television. The concept of communication is telecommunication, the television. So all these changes, air travel, all these changes have happened within this generation to a very huge degree in terms of commercial air travel, airliners as well. The whole mushrooming of growth of this takeoff that's happened from the 1950s onwards, 60s onwards. And this transformation is why do we call it the great acceleration, is because there was a conference in 2005 of various environmentalists, economists, and a working group was formed at a conference in Dahlem. I think it is in Germany, Dahlem conference, and the term great acceleration was coined during that conference, Dahlem. And the term was to capture trying to capture the changes that occurred 1950s से इतना तेज से accelerated way our thinking, our comprehension, our interlinks with nature that swept across the whole globe, socio-economically, biosphere, in our climate, in our biodiversity. All these changes start occurring so fast that the word great acceleration was coined during that conference. And since that time, there's been a movement globally to try to understand what this means and how do we relate to this conceptually. And one of the things that we have seen that there's like the waves of the sea, and like the weather and the climate, there's a hot and a cold. There's waves of changes, growth and collapse that happen in human civilization. Some civilization grows, then collapses, another comes, and there's been the pattern of human development. And people are hoping that population will stabilize at the end of this century. Because of this, because of this growth, there's bound to be, because of the pattern of human development and human civilizations, we are seeing that this growth will eventually lead to a collapse as well. If it's going up, it has to go down also. That's the logical conclusion. And how do we deal with this? When this collapse comes, that's when a very huge crisis is going to be faced by everyone, And this is the constant, not only debate, but constant conflict of ideas of how to deal with this. This is why, in terms of the climate talks of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, all these kind of international level negotiations are also stuck with different people having different ideas and different interests and different strategies and agendas of how to deal with this. And this is a very big issue that I want to talk about, that we want to think about. And we have till now, since ancient times, the concept of planetary stewardship, that's the question. How do we look after our planet? How do we look after planet Earth? How do we look after Earth has still not emerged. That conceptual framework has not emerged, though people are talking about it and certain people are thinking about it, it's not emerged as a global concept that all of us commonly share. How do we look after? And that is something that we are looking forward for a breakthrough in terms of urbanization and the planet. That if this trend of acceleration is going to continue, we have to come up with a planetary stewardship model. कैसे देखभाल करेंगे, this earth that we live on? How do we look after? And what does it mean to each of us individually, or each of our families, each of our households, each of our neighborhoods and villages, when we start applying this model of planetary stewardship? That is, and that's where it comes to stewardship is not ownership. So nobody is owner. That's the concept. We are only looking after. We are passing through. And that's our responsibility as we pass through to look after and leave it for our next generation. And not destroy and eat up everything as we pass through like locusts, Everything stripped, cleaned and go away, Leave nothing behind for the next lot, So the concept of ownership is something that I think we need to seriously challenge, to say that I own this, we own this country, this government owns that, These people, this indigenous tribe owns this forest. It's a concept which I think needs to be revisited in the way we understand it and in which they understand it. When you say that we own it, it may not be the same as when I say that I own something or I own, a piece of this pen. It's not the same as when a tribe says we own this forest. There are different ways of understanding ownership. And in the general, the native peoples, the peoples who are become the minorities today, they view ownership very, very differently because of this, because they relate very differently to their natural environment, and they see themselves as the children of nature, or the children of this mountain, or the children of this lake and this river. Because of that, ownership becomes a very different. It's like saying my mother is not the same as I own this woman, So it's very different.